For years, Harry H. Corbett made millions laugh with a single line, delivered the same way every time, sharp, exaggerated, unforgettable. But behind that voice, behind the character that defined British comedy, there were whispers that never quite went away. People questioned what he really thought about the role that made him famous, what truly happened between him and his co-star, and whether the man on screen was anything like the man at home. Those questions didn't disappear after his death. If anything, they grew louder. Now, decades later, his daughter has finally stepped in to address them. The role that made him and trapped him. When audiences think of Harry H. Corbett, they don't think of his early struggles, his training, or even his war experience. They think of one man, Harold Steptoe, a frustrated, sharp-tongued scrap dealer who dreamed of escaping a life he felt stuck in. That character wasn't just popular, it became inseparable from the actor himself. The sitcom Steptoe and Son didn't just succeed, it dominated. At its peak, it pulled in more than 28 million viewers, numbers that turned a television show into a national event. It was so influential that political figures worried it might keep people at home instead of going out to vote. That kind of reach didn't just create fame, it created a fixed identity. Every week, audiences waited for the same moment. The build-up was predictable, but the payoff never failed. Corbett would lean into the role, twist his voice, and deliver the line that defined him, "You dirty old man." It became more than a catchphrase. It became a cultural imprint. And from that point on, no matter what else he did, that was the version of him the public held on to. But what made Harold Steptoe so compelling also created a problem. The character was trapped, resentful, always reaching for something better and never quite getting there. Over time, people began to blur the line between the role and the man playing it. The frustration, the bitterness, the sense of being stuck, audiences assumed those feelings belonged to Corbett as well. That assumption became the first of many rumors. People began to ask whether he secretly resented the role, whether he felt limited by it, whether playing Harold had in some way defined his entire life. And unlike most rumors, this one didn't fade. It followed him through his career, and it continued long after he was gone. What makes this story more complicated is that there is some truth behind the question. Corbett did not arrive at this role as a comedian looking for easy laughs. He was a trained actor, someone who had studied method acting, who had worked in theater environments that demanded emotional depth and realism. Before Steptoe and Son, he had spent years building a career that was meant to go far beyond one character. So when that one character became everything, it created a tension that never fully disappeared. On one hand, the show gave him recognition, financial stability, and a place in television history. On the other, it narrowed the way people saw him. Producers hesitated to cast him in different roles. Audiences expected the same voice, the same expression, the same man. The rise and the man before the fame. Long before audiences ever heard that famous line, Harry H. Corbett had already lived a life that was far removed from television studios and scripted laughter. His story did not begin in England, but in Rangoon, Burma, where he was born into a military family. His father served as a quartermaster sergeant, and for a brief moment, it seemed like Harry's life would follow a structured, predictable path. But that stability disappeared almost immediately. When he was just 18 months old, his mother died from dysentery. It was a loss he was too young to understand, but one that shaped everything that followed. He was sent back to England and raised by his aunt in Manchester, growing up in a working-class environment where opportunity was limited and expectations were modest. This was not the background of a future television icon. It was the reality of a boy who had to adapt quickly, without the support system most children take for granted. In school, he showed intelligence and potential, even passing the scholarship exam for grammar school. But financial constraints made that path impossible. Instead, he attended a secondary school where resources were fewer, but where something else began to emerge. He developed a sharp wit, a natural timing, and an ability to observe people closely. These weren't formal acting skills yet, but they were the foundations of everything he would later become. Then came the war. Like many young men of his generation, he enlisted, joining the Royal Marines. This wasn't a brief or symbolic service. He experienced real combat, including hand-to-hand fighting in the Pacific. War has a way of stripping people down to their core, and for Harry, it left a lasting mark. It gave him an understanding of tension, fear, and human behavior that no acting school could teach. Those experiences would later influence the way he approached performance, adding a level of realism that audiences could feel, even if they didn't know why. After the war, his path was anything but straightforward. He spent time in Australia before returning to England, initially training as a radiographer. It was a practical choice, stable and respectable, but it didn't last. Something kept pulling him toward performance, toward the idea of becoming someone else, of telling stories in a different way. Eventually, he made the decision to pursue acting seriously. His early years in theater were not glamorous. He worked consistently, but without recognition. One of the most important turning points came when he joined Joan Littlewood's theater workshop. This was not a traditional acting environment. It was demanding, experimental, and deeply rooted in the principles of method acting. Here, Harry immersed himself in the Stanislavski system, learning to draw from personal experience to build authentic characters. He wasn't chasing fame at this stage. He was building craft. For over a decade, he worked in theater, television, and small film roles, slowly developing a reputation as a serious actor. To avoid confusion with another well-known entertainer of the same name, he added the middle initial H to become Harry H. Corbett, a small change that marked the beginning of a more defined professional identity. Then came the moment that would change everything. He was cast in a BBC comedy written by Ray Galton and Alan Simpson, originally intended as a one-off. The character was Harold Steptoe, a man caught between ambition and obligation, intelligence and frustration. It was a role that required more than just comedic timing. It demanded depth, contradiction, and emotional range. The chemistry between Harry and his co-star was immediate. What began as a single performance quickly turned into something much bigger. The BBC recognized it, the audience responded to it, and before long, a full series was commissioned. The man behind the character. As the success of Steptoe and Son continued to grow, so did the expectations placed on Harry H. Corbett. On screen, he was sharp, controlled, and precise. Off-screen, life became far less predictable. The more the show succeeded, the less space there was for him to exist beyond it. That tension was reflected in his personal life. His first marriage to actress Sheila Stiefel began long before fame, during his theater years. But as his career accelerated, the strain became impossible to ignore. Filming schedules, touring, and constant public attention placed pressure on the relationship, and it eventually ended in divorce, just as his career reached its peak. From the outside, everything looked like success. Privately, things were shifting. He later found stability with Maureen Blott, an actress and dancer. This marriage brought structure and grounding. Together they had 2 children, Susanna and Jonathan, and he embraced fatherhood with genuine enthusiasm, often describing his children as his greatest achievement. It was a side of him rarely seen by the public. But even in this more settled period, the pressure of fame intensified. Being tied so closely to one role meant constant comparison. Other opportunities were limited, and audiences struggled to see him as anything beyond Harold Steptoe. Over time, that created a psychological weight that was difficult to escape. Typecasting was not just a career issue, it became personal. No matter his training or earlier work, he was repeatedly pulled back into the same identity. That repetition slowly wore him down. To cope, He turned more heavily to alcohol. It was common in the industry at the time, but for him, it became a way to manage stress. Long schedules, public expectations, and the frustration of being unable to move beyond a single role created a cycle that was hard to break. At the same time, the physical demands of his work began to take a toll. Years of performance led to back problems and other health issues. These were not widely discussed, but they were part of his everyday reality. The turning point came with a heart attack. It was not sudden, but the result of years of strain and lifestyle habits. It forced him to confront the pace he had been living at. Afterward, he made changes, cutting back on drinking, managing stress more carefully, and becoming more selective with his work. Still, the effects of those earlier years remained. Despite everything, he did not step away from acting. He continued working in television and on stage, even if none of those roles matched the success of Steptoe and Son. They represented something important, an effort to redefine himself beyond one character. In his later years, his perspective began to shift. The frustration softened, replaced by a greater appreciation for what the show had achieved. He recognized the laughter it brought and the connection it created with audiences. At the same time, he became more focused on his family. Away from public attention, he valued the moments that had once been overshadowed by work. These quieter years revealed a different side of him, one less concerned with public perception and more grounded in the people closest to him. Debunking the rumors. For years after Harry H. Corbett passed away, the stories about him didn't fade, they grew. Without a clear voice from his family, assumptions filled the gaps. Some described him as bitter about his most famous role, while others claimed his relationship with his co-star had been deeply hostile. Over time, these ideas were repeated so often they began to feel like fact. That is what led his daughter, Susanna Corbett, to step forward. Her motivation was personal. She had watched her father's image slowly shift into something she no longer recognized. The man she knew was being reduced to simplified narratives that ignored the complexity of his life. One of the most persistent rumors focused on his relationship with Wilfred Bramble. On screen, their tension felt real, but off-screen, people assumed that meant genuine dislike. Susanna addressed this directly. She explained that while they were very different people and sometimes grew irritated after years of working together, there was no deep feud. They were not a traditional comedy duo built on friendship, but professional actors who came to work and then went home. She also pointed to something that contradicts the rumor entirely. After the series ended, they chose to tour internationally together, something unlikely if they truly could not stand one another. The reality, as she described it, was far less dramatic than the version that had circulated for years. Another rumor centered on his attitude toward the show itself. Some claimed he resented the role that made him famous. Susanna offered a more balanced view. She acknowledged that he felt frustration from being typecast, but made it clear this was not the same as regret. He understood what the show had given him: recognition, stability, and a lasting legacy. In his later years, he openly appreciated that, even while recognizing its limitations. The need to correct these misconceptions became more urgent after a BBC dramatization presented a version of his life the family felt was misleading. It emphasized conflict and emotional strain, making for compelling television but not a complete picture. In response, Susanna shared details that only someone close to him could provide. She spoke about his humor at home, his interactions with his children, and the small everyday moments that revealed who he really was beyond the screen. She also addressed more personal rumors about his lifestyle. She did not deny that he enjoyed the attention that came with fame, especially in earlier years. But she emphasized that once he settled down and had a family, his priorities changed. He made an effort to be present, even bringing his children along on tours. What her account ultimately shows is not a complete reversal of the story, but a correction. The truth was more balanced, more human, and far less extreme than the rumors suggested. Final years, death and legacy. In the final chapter of Harry H. Corbett's life, the pace began to change. The intensity that had once defined him gradually gave way to something quieter. He was still working, still appearing on stage and television, but with a clear shift in focus. His health forced that change. After a serious heart attack, he became more aware of his limits. Years of stress and heavy smoking had taken their toll. Even as he tried to cut back and adjust his lifestyle, the long-term effects remained. He understood that time was no longer something he could take for granted. Still, he did not withdraw completely. He continued acting, but more carefully, choosing roles with less pressure and more intention. There was less need to prove himself and more acceptance of what he had already achieved. At home, this shift was even more evident. He spent more time with his wife Maureen and their children, Susanna and Jonathan, valuing the ordinary moments that had once been overshadowed by work. According to Susanna, he took real pride in his family, showing a warmth that contrasted with his more reserved public image. Even in these quieter years, his humor remained. He responded quickly to fans, turning simple encounters into light exchanges, and at home he stayed playful, often blending his instincts as a performer into everyday life. He was also aware of how he would be remembered. He knew Harold Steptoe would always define him, but instead of resisting it, he began to appreciate what it had brought, the laughter, the audience, and the lasting impact. His death came while his daughter was still young. Their final interaction was simple. He asked for a pair of shoes, and she brought the wrong ones. It was an ordinary moment that later carried weight. Soon after, while she was away on a school trip he had encouraged, he passed away in hospital. There was no spectacle around his passing, but the impact was immediate. Fans continued to visit his grave, leaving notes, a quiet sign that his work had stayed with them. His legacy is not just one role, but how that role endured. New generations continue to discover it, respond to it, and share it. And through his daughter's efforts to clarify his story, that legacy has become more complete, not rewritten, but understood with greater depth. Harry H. Corbett gave audiences a character they never forgot, but his real life turned out to be far more complicated than most people realized. Now that more of the truth has come out, do you see him differently than before? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.